Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Norwich Congregational Church on behalf of our Climate Action Group. We're excited to see so many people joining us from outside the church. First, some housekeeping. The bathrooms are down the hall here behind me to the right. Feel free to excuse yourself during the program if you need to. Just past those bathrooms is our parish hall, and we're going to be offering some light refreshments after the program for anybody who'd like to stay behind and have some conversation and fellowship. So the climate emergency has always called for people to come together and join forces, and never has that been more true than this year. The forces arrayed against a healthy environment, safety for political expression and organizing, even the ability of people to care for the health and economic well-being of themselves and their families are stronger than at any time in the last 80 years. Our guest tonight knows something about how to prepare for struggle, how to persist even when the outlook is uncertain, and how to leverage action to enable hope, not blind optimism, but a hope that can only come from knowing that our challenges are solvable and that together we are the only ones able to solve them. Let me tell you just a bit about them. Gus Speth is an environmental lawyer, founder of the Natural Resources Defense Council. He's been at the center of almost every battle around the protection of the environment for the last 50 years. He's the author of many books, including America the Possible, They Knew, and Bridge at the End of the World. Reverend Jim Antal is a UCC minister, a senior denominational leader, climate activist, author, and public theologian. He serves as special advisor on climate justice to the general minister and the president of the United Church of Christ. His book, Climate Church, Climate World, has educated and motivated hundreds of church congregations around the world, and in fact was the primary motivator for us to start our climate action group about 7 years ago. So like many good friendships, Jim and Gus's began in jail. That's right, protesting the Keystone XL pipeline outside the White House in 2011. Jim and Gus and our good friend Bill McKibben were arrested with dozens of other protesters and then spent 3 days and 3 nights together in jail before being released. A few months later, Jim and his wife moved here to Norwich. Gus is also local, being a resident of Stratford. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Gus Speth and Reverend Jim Antal. Our format we're going to follow tonight is each of our guests is going to do a bit of a discussion first, and then pretty quickly its plan is to go into Q&A, and then we can continue whatever conversations and back down with the refreshments.
Thanks so much, John. And thank you all for coming tonight. I have here a text a prepared text that I'm going to use, because otherwise I'll wander all over the place. And I want to limit the time that I'm talking, and Gus is going to do likewise, so that we can do the most important thing that we're here to do, which is to respond to your questions, okay? So here we go. I want to begin by offering what some might refer to as some big picture observations. Let's start with an encouraging observation, all right? And when it comes to the climate crisis, what we need to realize is we, that is humanity, we can do this. The scientists, the engineers, they have done their job. Humanity already has all the solutions we need to make a complete transition to a clean, reliable, renewable energy system. A group of the world's top climate scientists have recently shown that by 2035, that's 10 years from now, electricity from wind, water, and solar could provide all the energy the world needs for heating, cooling, transportation, and industry. And that making this transition will pay for itself in only 6 years. Not only that, but as we make this transition, we can address economic and racial inequities And by doing so, we will reap benefits far greater than the costs. The 2021 infrastructure bill was a good start. Congress committed over $200 billion for climate-related projects. And then the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act was a great follow-up, promising over $1 trillion of investment in clean climate energy and related projects. Unfortunately, this reality, the fact that we can actually do this reality is a problem. It's a huge problem for the fossil fuel industry because it confirms that humanity no longer needs the fossil fuel industry. And let me offer a full confession. This isn't part of the text. I grew up in a family of scientists, as some of you know. God knows why I became an ethicist and a theologian. My dad was the head chemical engineer for Mobil Oil. So I've been talking about this stuff since the 1950s. Humanity can get all the power it needs from clean and renewable sources of sunlight, wind, and water. And obviously that's a threat to the fossil fuel industry. So it should be no surprise that the fossil fuel companies, they saw this coming. In the late 1970s, fossil fuel companies ran full-page ads saying, think of us as energy companies, not as oil, coal, and gas companies. And they even funded solar research. My brother actually got some of that funding. Then they also hired the best climate scientists in the world. And in the late 1970s, those climate scientists told the board of Exxon, back then Exxon was one company, Mobil was another company, they told the board of Exxon that if humanity kept using their product as it was intended to be used, a climate crisis would soon arise that would threaten the life of our planet. Then, in the mid-1980s, after the fossil fuel companies invented fracking, they fired those climate scientists. They embraced the promise of unlimited profits, and they poured hundreds of millions of dollars into a PR campaign to deceive the public, deny climate science, discredit climate scientists, discard science records, and fund politicians who deny that climate change is real. It's not just the fossil fuel companies. 1/4 of our current members of Congress deny that climate change is real. And our current president has issued executive orders deleting climate data, firing climate scientists, cutting the National Weather Service, denying disaster relief, reducing wildfire fighters, loosening restrictions on air and water pollution, and relinquishing the government's authority to regulate pollution. In addition to the catastrophic direct consequences of these executive orders, all of this seeks to end the national discussion about the climate crisis. America now stands alone in rejecting climate science. So let me be clear. As I say in my book, you and I are now living in a theological emergency. Our generation has allowed one of God's first commandments, that we are to till and keep God's creation, that we are to preserve our common home. Our generation has allowed this commandment to be reduced to an ideological debate. Listen to what climate scientist and evangelical Christian Katharine Hayhoe has to say. I'm quoting now. People do not understand the magnitude of what's going on. This will be greater than anything we have ever seen in the past. This will be unprecedented. Every living thing will be affected. If we continue with business as usual greenhouse gas emissions, there is no adaptation that is possible. Our infrastructure, worth trillions of dollars, built over decades, was built for a planet that no longer exists. The reality is that we will not have anything left that we value if we do not address the climate crisis. End quote. Because young people, people of color, and indigenous people realize that the warnings from Katharine and other climate scientists are true, they were among the first climate activists. They also recognized that all the justice issues we care about, increased inequality, immigration, poverty, hunger, homelessness, and the lack of potable water, these injustices are all amplified by the unjust acquisition, extraction, distribution, and profit from the energy stored under our feet. And thank God I can now say that thanks to Pope Francis and thanks to the head of the Orthodox Church, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, and thanks to hundreds of other outspoken faith leaders, including our denomination, those of us from this congregation, the United Church of Christ, people of faith, as well as countless others, are coming together, standing up, and speaking out. Now, before I turn it over to Gus, I want to briefly offer several suggestions of what we can do. My hope is that at least one of these suggestions will speak to each and every one of you. As it turns out, you and I have been given the gift of life at a time of great peril. But as Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young remind us, it's always darkest just before the dawn. And as the poet Theodore Rutke reminds us, in a dark time, the eye begins to see. Suggestion number one comes from Katharine Hayhoe. Katharine suggests that the most important thing you can do to engage the climate crisis is to talk about it. Only 35% of Americans talk about climate change, even occasionally, in spite of the fact that a majority of Americans are alarmed or concerned about climate, which is more than twice as many who are doubtful or dismissive. And when it comes to Christian leaders, while 90% agree that humans are changing the climate, only half of clergy report discussing climate change with their congregations, and only a quarter have brought up the topic more than once. We all need to talk about the climate crisis. We need to tell people that a majority of other people think that a climate crisis is happening. It's human-caused, it's a serious problem, and it's time for all of us to take action. Here's suggestion number two. Don't be shy to invoke the most universal religious principle, a teaching that is found at the core of every major world religion. The golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And please include among the others unborn future generations. Suggestion number 3. Living as we are in a time when truth itself is on the scaffold, facts and data are in the garbage, and science and critical thinking are under attack. We need to recognize, elevate, and practice Jesus' teaching that the truth will set you free. To abandon truth and facts is to abandon freedom. If you want to understand this more thoroughly, the best possible guide is Timothy Snyder's little book on tyranny. Suggestion number 4. When Jesus said, whatever you do to the least of these, whatever you did to the least of these, you did it unto me. He wasn't offering a metaphor. He was holding up a mirror. For people of faith, justice is not an afterthought, and defense of creation is a campaign for justice. Support organizations who are addressing the needs of the least of these among us. Speak out against policies that punish the poor for their poverty, or that abandon the victims of flood, fire, drought, and tornado so that the rich will have a Golden Dome missile shield. That was in the newspaper today, by the way. In addition to their luxury underground shelters. And here's my final suggestion, number 5. Accept God's call to live into a new story, a fossil fuel-free story, a story in which we join with millions of others as we fearlessly realign our time, our energy, our gifts, our attention, and our assets to respond to the call now heard around the world. If you have any questions about how you and your family might live into this new story, we'd be glad to hear them during our Q&A. And any other questions that you may have, let's make that a really good conversation. Now I want to turn it over to Gus. Gus?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Everybody hear me? I'm good. Thank you. It's great to see everyone. I have such unbounded respect and admiration for Jim Antal, and it's just a delight to be here with him. What a great man. And he's right to seek to inspire us to act. And that was a powerful call to act and to do things that can make a difference. What he says is actually true, unlike a lot of what you hear on this subject today. I want to really stress a few other points that Jim didn't stress. Perhaps I should begin with a note that I sent around to my 1,000 best friends on Earth Day. And I tried to, this past April, to summarize some of my thought about where we are today on this issue. So I said to my friends then that, as you know, we knew enough a half-century ago to take the climate change threat with great seriousness. At that time, I was in the Carter administration at the beginning of it, and we did a lot on climate change way back then. But we did not take it with great seriousness in the intervening decades. Even today, this is the ongoing failing for which our descendants will least forgive us. And reflecting on this situation today, I said in this note to them that I can only conclude that our system of political economy is incapable of rising to the climate challenge given its current configuration. We've had a 50-year test to whether we can come to grips with this problem, and at every turn, we haven't. And I said, this is the lesson of history and a long life. We struggle today to rescue and restore the status quo ante, to reclaim what we at least had before the current situation. But can this also be a time, I asked them, for building a new political economy where the routine priorities are the well-being of people, place, and planet? And that is my sort of summation of where I've come to after all these years. Some facts, I think, tend to support this. Our energy is still, after all this time, 80% of fossil fuel, both in the United States and in the world, 80%. Last year, we had the highest rate of greenhouse gases, level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in history, despite all the efforts that have been made. We also had the highest global emissions of greenhouse gases in history last year. The trajectory is really linearly up. There was an assessment done of how the famous Paris Accords are being implemented, done a year and a half ago, and it concluded that world governments, including the U.S., were failing to meet the obligations, even this weak pledges that they had made as part of the Paris arrangement internationally. So we're in deep trouble, I think. There was a recent report that just came out a day or two ago saying that the ice in the poles is going to continue to melt at an accelerating rate if we, almost basically irregardless, as we used to, my history teacher used to say, irregardless, regardless of what our actions might be, because it said that this melting is going to accelerate at the current level of 1.2 degrees global average warming, and will really accelerate when we get to 1.5 degrees global average warming. And that and if you know the data, you know that 1.5 degrees is really just a few years into the future in terms of warming. So we've bought a very difficult situation. And one of the things that I have tried to do is how do we compute all of this? How do we think about where we are, how we got here, what we can do, what our obligations are, and the downside of so much of this and the upside that Jim mentioned that we can do it. How do we compute on all of that? And I came up with what I call a little 5 steps to climate sanity. And I referred to it as something, an agenda between despair on the one hand and hopium on the other. And I have a poem about hopium that I'm dying to read to you, but I'm not, unless you ask for it. Anyhow, so I want to give you these 5 steps. 1, learn. Stay abreast of the climate science. Accept its difficult conclusions as the best information that we have and the best understanding that we have, and expect to be alarmed and disturbed on a regular basis. Second, cry. We have to accept also that both societies and natural systems are already fated to devastating developments. Terrible losses lie ahead. Even if we were to stop all emissions today, which we are so very far from doing, terrible things will continue. And we aren't going to come anywhere near stopping. And so that is, future isn't what it used to be. And having a great sadness in response to this is a normal human reaction. 3, get mad. Recognize that the warnings about climate change and forceful proposals to act go back 5 decades. I was fortunate enough to have a chance to write some of them in the Carter administration when I was Carter's environmental advisor. The failure to act over these years may be the greatest failure of civic responsibility in the history of the Republic. 4, dream. Appreciate that no matter how tearful the future, every fraction of a degree of warming makes a difference. Every bit of warming we prevent is important. So we must learn what is to be done to head off future warming and future devastations, including, and this is important, both the immediate kinds of steps that Jim mentioned, but also the deep societal and economic transformations that got us into this problem in the first place. And 5, fight. We know that the fight for the future, as Jim says, requires all of us, each bringing what we can to the effort. Find ways to get involved, depending on our skills, our access, our contacts. And remember this, in the end, our willingness to fight, our commitment to fight, doesn't really depend on the odds of our success. We've got to act even if the situation is hopeless. We are warriors defending a sacred place. And we do it simply because it's the right thing to do. Rebelling beyond hope, because the human spirit tells us with insistence that what is unacceptable, all the suffering, all the loss, all the tears, simply cannot be accepted. So that's my effort to put it together. And I think it's, I'd like to stress for a moment that my point there that we need a societal transformation to deal with this issue. There are immediate things that we can do within the context of the current system of political economy, dealing with our politics as it is, dealing with our society as it is. But if we want to deal successfully with this problem over time, we're going to have to change our political economy. And a fundamental feature of that is our change in values. We need a deep transformation of consciousness and the values and the habits of thought that we bring to everyday affairs. And I will conclude with this note. I've written a dozen books now, some of them better than others, and literally 100 at least significant articles that I think of as worth noting. And in all that body of work, nothing I have ever written has gone viral. But I was at a conference one time, and I said something, and a minister there picked it up and wrote it in one of his books. And then Jim Antal picked it up and wrote it in one of his books. And pretty soon it was viral, and it was circulating all over the internet. And it was Pearl Jam tweeted it, and things happened all of a sudden. So, and it does say something important. I guess that wouldn't have happened, but all that effort to write something good, and it was just some comment I made at a conference. So here it is. I used to think that top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness and greed and apathy, and to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And that, I think, has resonated with religious and faith communities as pointing to their role, really, in bringing, and your role in bringing about the transformation that we need. So thank you very much. Don't forget to ask me about my poem.
So I'm gonna walk around with the microphone for anyone who's got questions. Did you all want any more back and forth before we do that?
Questions for Jim. How did you like the central cell block of the DC jail?
I was going to ask about the food.
So earlier, John was asking me how many times I had been to jail, almost all of them for environmental protests, and I think it's over a dozen. But I always lived in fear of the central cell block in Washington, D.C. And that's because the best man at our wedding, a colleague of mine, a classmate of mine at Yale Divinity School, Dean Hammer, he was one of the Plowshare Eight. Those were the clergy, the Berrigan brothers and others who protested nuclear weapons, and they saw significant jail time. But Dean always told me, whatever you do, Jim, don't do a civil disobedience action that lands you in the jail in Washington, D.C. So Gus and I and Bill McKibben and 60 others were lined up in front of the White House, and I can't remember if that was the day we put little plastic bands around our wrists up against the fence there. Anyway, the police came and put us into the wagons, and they took us to the central jail block. And in spite of the fact that our lawyers, who were very good lawyers for actions, had assured us, no chance you guys are going to be put in jail. The reality is McKibben, with all of his organizing skills, had lined up 2 weeks worth of people, roughly 50 every day, to get arrested. 2 weeks. Biggest civil disobedience action in 30 years in America. This was the first day of it. The administration, Obama's administration, knew the plan, and so they figured they'd make an example of us, put us in jail, and maybe that would cause the rest of them to not line up. Well, it turns out they put us in jail, and the people who got arrested the day after us were double the number that we were that day. But because it was a Friday, we were in jail until Monday. And the stainless steel bed without a mattress, and when you're laying in bed, the light up above you 24/7, and as a vegetarian, the bologna sandwiches were, let us say, not really hospitable. But the real problem was...
The real problem was having to ask for toilet paper.
Yeah, there was that as well. But from time to time, we got moved around, or maybe it was only at the end, I can't remember exactly. And for some time, more than an hour, we were in the jail block with just all the regular DC criminals, not sort of nice people doing protesting. And it was, as somebody who spent, a good many times in jail, it was quite an eye-opener.
Yeah, we were going to walk out of there after 3 days anyhow, but you didn't take much imagination to realize that the other kids there in leg irons like us were in the so-called criminal justice system for a long time and would be very lucky to get anywhere near the walking out of the system that we were able to do. The other thing we learned, of course, is don't get arrested on Friday.
Full stop.
The law goes away for the weekend and just leaves you there.
Well, let's have some good questions.
So I'm gonna start with one and take the prerogative as the guy with the mic. I'm gonna start with your number 5, Gus, your admonition that we need to fight. How do you look at the interplay between the time horizons that we're dealing with this crisis and the urgency of what we should each be asking ourselves to be willing to do?
Right. Well, it's sort of past urgent. We've already built up, and the sheer momentum of the current situation is going to produce a disastrous situation for the planet. And we see nothing happening right now. In fact, we are moving backwards, of course, on what to do. So it's urgent and beyond urgent. So that to me means sort of three things, I guess. One is that we've got every degree does matter, and the kinds of actions that we can take to promote renewables, to cut down on what is often forgotten, our energy wastefulness, and to cut way back on energy consumption. Everything we can do in that realm of traditional climate action, and the kind of things that, God bless him, Joe Biden pushed, we desperately need to do. Secondly, one thing we learned in this campaign that we just went through to elect a president and other officials was that in terms of sheer political power, the climate movement and the climate concern is next to nowhere. After all these decades, we have not built up a powerful political force, partly because we've all been 501c3 groups and proscribed from electioneering and getting into a lot of things that need to be done. But we have not built the mighty political force that we need. And so, my plea is for the NGOs and come together and let's build a political force that is capable of fighting to get rid of bad members of Congress, to get stopping bad legislation and getting good legislation passed. We've got to build that political force. And the third thing is, don't drop all your papers. The third thing is that we, thank you, not really important. The third thing is that we need to think about what type of society we want to build as we come out of the disaster and the awfulness that we're now in the middle of. Do we want to just go back to the status quo ante, the world that we grew up in and lived in, a world of runaway consumerism, of misguided social values, of a lack of community concerns in our country, where half the people in the country are just getting by paycheck to paycheck at best. Do we want to go back to that, or do we want to begin to think about a new political economy that really does give priority to people and place and planet? And I think we've got to change the system, and there's a slogan that keeps reappearing in climate rallies and marches across the country, and the slogan is system change, not climate change. And so, those would be my prescription, right?
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the need for leadership?
Well, this man has been a real leader in the faith community.
I mean the political leadership.
Oh, you mean that?
Yeah.
Well, we in the current election, past election, we had every reason to be alarmed about the climate issue, and the contrast between the candidates in the initial part of the election was very, very stark. One, Ms. Harris really had a very strong position, and the current president promised that he was going to do what he's been doing. Leaders, that's the problem with leadership at the top, is that we don't have enough power to, force good actions like some other constituencies, including the fossil fuel industry, have. And, an example of that is you could just see Kamala Harris move off of her tough climate positions as the campaign unfolded. One after another, when she backed up and started abandoning her prior positions, for example, in support of the Green New Deal. And so that's, and even today, you have, public concern and outrage about so many things, but the outrage about the climate issue is just beginning to bubble up, and indeed has so much competition with people being dismissed and agencies being destroyed and other things. But it is a desperate need to make the climate change, as Jim said in his first thing, talk about it and get it strongly on the agenda. And Bill McKibben, God bless him, is launching with others something called Sunday. And so check out Sunday on the internet. It's going to be a celebration, and that's the other kind of leadership, is leadership from the bottom, so to speak, leadership from our, civil society, our non-governmental organizations, our faith community, and others. So we have the other problem, in terms of leadership, is that we have a democracy that really is quite hobbled, and it was hobbled before the current administration. We had lots of efforts to try to get good reform legislation to strengthen pro-democracy performance in the U.S., and it consistently failed in our Congress. The John Lewis Act and other things. Amy Klobuchar has a great piece of legislation to strengthen the democratic performance in our country. Who in the world is thinking about it right now? So anyhow, I think there's such an agenda here for us of building strength, of building real democracy, of embracing communities that don't normally think about climate change, activating those who do think about climate change but have been politically inert. This is a world we've got to attack in all those fronts.
Your comments about making a change in society make a good segue into my question. I'm constantly concerned about the Citizens United decision, and I want to hear from both of you, or singularly, is there any chance that we can get that reversed, because I see that as a cornerstone of the degradation of our society and the fact that corporations can buy their politicians. And I think it's absolutely the worst thing that ever happened to us.
Take it, Jim.
Comments, please.
Well, I think you've got some agreement up here on stage with that. I'll let Gus comment on the likelihood that it could be reversed, but the comment about Citizens United connects with the earlier question about leadership, and it seems to me what's fundamentally at stake, and it's for our generation and subsequent generations. What's fundamentally at stake, or a different way of saying it, is the actual problem that put us here is the unchecked, as Gus put it in his now famous quote, the unchecked greed that dominates most of life in America. Our current president got elected because, in many ways, for many reasons, but one of them was because so many people admired the alleged success he had with his alleged business. The word alleged there is double underlined. We still, as a society, are willing to let ourselves be ruled by wealth. And when Citizens United got decided, we allowed our politics to be ruled by wealth. And we are now seeing the pinnacle of the richest man in the world as the co-president ruling our nation by wealth and making decisions so as to increase that wealth in ways that none of us can imagine. So somehow, what lies before us is an opportunity, as Gus has been saying, to embrace a system of life together that is not ruled by wealth or the desire for wealth. A system that would be ruled, for example, by justice. A system that would nurture and enhance neighborliness and love. And that's possible. Is it possible tomorrow? Is it possible in a few years? No. But just as the transition, complete and thorough, to a fossil fuel-free society is possible within the lifetime of many of us, it is also possible, not speaking to the Citizens United ruling specifically, but it is possible for us to make a transition for how we, that is those of us who are alive today, shall live. And then my final comment, which also relates to the previous question, is that in order to effect that transition, it's probably the case, and this has to do with my comments about wealth as well, it's probably the case that each of us has to drill down deeply inside and ponder, what is my vocation? Of the gifts I have been given in life, what am I called to do in the context of the reality of the world that has been placed before me? I went to, as an undergrad, all of my intellectual ability was in math and physics, and I went to college to major in math and physics, and it became pretty obvious to me by my sophomore year that ethics was the thing that I was being called to do. So I set aside what appeared to be my intellectual gifts and pursued ethics, and then eventually, quite to my resistance, ministry. But I think the question of vocation is the most profound question in our country right now. And if the church can help, and the synagogue and the mosque can help people pivot from the sort of premier position that wealth and the pursuit of wealth has to a position in which life together with justice, peace, and love, if we can make that pivot, we will all have to ponder, how am I called to contribute to that?
Thank you. Jim, that was great. I have some thoughts. I'm not optimistic that the Supreme Court can be reversed, or that that's going to happen anytime soon anyhow. But there are some things we can do. One is we can keep breathing life in the Move to Amend movement. It had support. Everybody's mind is so preoccupied now with current events, but it had support. The amendments have been framed and have been promoted to undo the idea that money is speech, and that corporations are people. And so we need to pursue those amendments. Secondly, there certainly in a better political environment, there are ways that some of the laws can be tightened up, even if we're not going to wholesale, fly in the face of the Supreme Court decisions. But there are there are disclosure rules, a tremendous amount of dark money, so-called, out there, and there can be better disclosures and perhaps some restrictions put on to further protect the political process from some of the funding mechanisms. That can be done. And thirdly, and maybe most importantly, when I was writing one of my books, I did a good bit of work thinking about and researching federally funded elections. And the framework for doing that has been explored, and so the general idea is that if a candidate can get enough small contributions, the federal government can put a lot of money into a campaign. So those laws need to be improved, and we need to create a path for government financing of campaigns, and that would I think so in other words, all of these things, at least the last two things I mentioned, would tend to shrink the importance of big money.
Hi. My friend Kathleen Shepard couldn't be here, but she asked me to pose the following. She would like to hear some discussion about the environmental destruction caused by building weaponry and our militarized economy. She's read that even without war that uses all those weapons, their environmental destruction far outweighs everything we do to reduce waste and make good consumer choices. Do you have information about that?
First off, she's 100% right. The connection between environmental destruction and war making is unambiguous, undeniable, and huge. And it's been that way for a long, long time. And people are thinking about this. People are aware of this. Almost every time I talk in a setting like this, I get this more or less same question. I used to be, a long time ago in the 80s, head of the largest religious pacifist organization in the country, the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And so for me personally in my life, my commitment to anti-war work and my commitment to environmental work, they're really one in the same. And so ultimately, to solve the environmental problem of climate change, we're also going to have to create a world that doesn't need all those war weapons and that doesn't interact with people who are different from us in ways that prompt environmental destruction, warfare, and so forth. Ultimately, it's about how are we going to behave, interact with, trust, etc., people who are different from us. That's the ultimate solution, and that solution, if we can use that word, relative to war and the reasons that spark wars, that solution also then doesn't fully address the environmental challenge, but it significantly, to the point of the questioner, significantly addresses it.
Hi. I own in Vermont 260 acres of land, which my husband and I bought in the 60s. And so that land I have in a state program called current use. And I'm sure you're familiar with that. And so the current use requires every 10 years that land be logged. And so I've never been quite sure, is that a benefit? Is that good for the environment? And we're just winding up this year's logging, and it's nice because it gets me some extra money. But what is the environmental impact, positive or negative, of this particular program?
I was a dean of a school of forestry, but I was I realized right away I didn't know much. Felicity, I think it's a great program that Vermont has, and we need to support its continuation, the current use program. There's a myth that was very common at one time, that sort of rapidly growing young trees would fix more carbon, take more carbon out of the atmosphere and be good for the climate issue, that the rapidly growing young trees would be better than old growth just standing there. The latest data that I've seen suggests that that's not true, that old growth stands are really very effective in helping with the climate. And so I think we need to visit, if it hasn't been done lately, the dimensions of cutting that are prescribed. I don't think, some people here may know a lot more about this than I do, but I don't think the prescriptions really, require wholesale logging of your property. They can be very selective, as I understand it. So, Vermont uses a lot of wood. I don't think it's a big environmental issue. I don't personally think, having some harvesting is important. I'm going to say I do think having some harvesting is important for all the Vermont needs. There is another issue which is bigger, and that is what happens in the Green Mountain National Forest, and whether we have, protection of our big forest resources in the state. And that's an issue that I think is important, but don't pretend to know a great deal about. So anyhow, that's my only thought.
You probably know this, but of course it gets us a huge reduction in our property taxes.
Yes. It's a boon.
I've got a quote, a quick question, and a not-so-quick question. John Woolman was a 18th century Quaker mystic and said, "Look to your possessions for the seeds of war." look to your possessions for the seeds of war. A quick question, and I'll ask them both, and you all can answer how you wish. An awful lot of very deliberate and calculated misinformation is out there around climate change. Do you have good sources to go where we can get information to counter those pernicious claims? And the second question is about greed. It's really easy to point at other people and say your act is greedy, but very few of those other people would admit that what they're doing is not the result of some need that they perceive. So how do we define greed in a way that it can be pointed out objectively that this act is the result of greed, in ourselves or in others or in corporations?
You mentioned the second question again, not the third one. I'm going to let Jim answer the third one.
A source of information.
Oh, the information. Yes,
Around
thank you.
misinformation.
I follow the science very closely, and I have since the Carter administration. I read Nature, and I read Science, and I read the other magazines, New Scientist and others. And I have to say that the news lately, in the last half a dozen years, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, even the Wall Street Journal, and other magazines, Atlantic and others, their coverage of the climate issue is damn good. And there's so much information, there's hardly a major story that in the science journals that doesn't get mentioned in the daily media. So if people want to know the truth and get the real lowdown on what's happening, read the top newspapers and magazines in the country, because it's there. For example, I saw the article about the polar ice being threatened, and in the Science Journal. But then I noticed that there were stories in both the New York Times and the Washington Post about that. So this is, it is, in my view, at this point, you have to steer away from the truth about the climate issue to miss it. And of course, if you steer on to Fox News, well, you won't get much about it. The news networks have not been particularly good. If you add up the minutes that they spend talking about climate, it's very limited. But the serious journals are darn good now, finally, on the climate issue, in my view. And now Jim's going to solve the greed problem for us.
First, I want to say that I agree with Gus's response to that question. As somebody with a science background, I'm actually both pleasantly shocked and pleasantly surprised that the major news media, they get the climate science pretty well. This question that you put about people's self-perceptions relative to their possessions, to go back to your first quote. What came to me when you asked that question was the word enough. We don't have a vital sense of enough as a moral value. We don't have a sense of sufficiency as a moral value. And then to flip what I've just said, we don't have a well-developed understanding of the moral decay when a person is lacking in a sense of enough. And yet all those values that I've just articulated, I'm sure it's obvious to everybody sitting here that, oh yeah, I've run into that value before, and it could become a big part of my life. It just is that in terms of our life together, and to your point, for most of us individually, the notion of enough is, I'll say it sort of bluntly, the notion of enough is not a driving force. See, that shows the absurdity of what I'm saying, right? The notion of enough is not a driving force. What if it were? What if enough, what if sufficiency were a driving force? Well, the drive would have to be a moral drive, as opposed to an acquisitiveness sense, which Augustine and Aquinas and plenty of other moral philosophers have wrote tons on. So that's my response. It's a challenging question, but I thank you for it. Yeah.
It's good that we've ended on some easy stuff here. So we're over time, and I love that we're not out of questions. So I hope that is going to be sufficient motivation to bring everyone down the hall for some refreshments where you can continue the discussion. And I hope that Reverend Antal and Mr. Speth will indulge us for some more questions over some coffee or some. Yes, we have a takeaway from the Climate Action Group. This is a list of personal actions that you can take that make an impact on the climate. That's something that some of them are big, some of them are small, all of them matter. Yes, they're the little green papers, and there's some in the back there. Oh, the poem. Okay.
The poem.
Do the poem, which will give me a chance to put out the cream.
I just put it on, Clara. All right.
While Gus is looking for his poem, let me just elaborate on one of the first comments about Sunday, which is one of Bill McKibben's, once again, excellent ideas. This is going to be September 20th and 21st. So it's the equinox, right? Is that right? The vernal equinox, or no, autumnal equinox. This is, you won't find this, there's a website, sunday.earth, that you can go to with a lot more information. And you will not find there what I'm about to say here, which is, the plan is that all the environmental organizations in the country will come together. All the people of faith of various denominations and faith perspectives will come together in order to advocate for God's creation, for our climate, and for our water and earth. And maybe we just might have an impact not unlike the first Earth Day. And some of you are of an age, as I am, to remember the first Earth Day, 10% of the American population participated. That would be 33 million people today. And we can do this. So I've been rallying people of faith all over the country about this. I have a big article coming out in a couple of weeks on this. I'll make sure that a link for that goes out in our church newsletter here and get it posted in the whatever it is that goes out to the various communities around here. But this is going to be a nationwide thing and a big deal. Gus, how about your poem?
Well, now to something important. This poem is written in the first person, but I hope it's not me. It's called Hopium. It takes a lot of hopium to get me through the day. There's always more hopium. I'll take it anyway. I can grow my own hopium. My mind is a fertile field. The less I know, the more I grow. You can't beat that deal. I got a bumper crop last year when I turned off the news. Being hopeful was easy when I took a long news snooze. There are far worse addictions. Opium just affects the mind. Yet in terms of climate worries, it leaves them far behind. Dreamy hope, comforting hope, whenever needed, it's there. There's always more hopium when I'm in my easy chair. Hope without cost, hope without consequence. This hope's a dope's dope in a cauldron of innocence. Thank you.
That was good.